relatively late because the process took, was a careful process that took some time, that it's not practical or possible for districts to implement them on such a short time scale.
Okay, but we're going to be the ones who are going to be delivering the message, and so I just want to think forward on this so that we this is a very positive development, and I want to keep it being a positive result and perceived as such.
So the one piece of information there is that that I want to be clear about. You say we'll be the messenger. Technically speaking, this section of the law revises a section of the law that OSPI has stewardship of and has rule writing authority over, and is not embedded in the state board's high school graduation requirements. So we will be the messenger insofar as we're talking about that the board approved them or didn't or whatever. I'm not presuming, but we actually won't be the messenger in terms of the parameters of frequently asked questions or implementation. That would be consistent with how CTE course implements has always been implemented, which is through OSPI's office and the ladies over there, so which we'll be hearing from.
Do you want to our other guests? Welcome back.
Thank you very much. Nice to be back. And thank you for the opportunity to share with you the really fantastic work that's gone into the frameworks. Dr. Chadwick is going to do that. Betty and I are going to be here to answer questions, and we have some questions that were already posed to us that we can answer, or we can just see what you want to have answered, whichever way you prefer. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Chadwick. I need to let you know that at SPI we did not do this in isolation either. The director for math and the director for science were heavily involved in this process from the beginning all the way through. And neither one of them could be here today, but they did provide me with their cell phone numbers. So if you have questions that you want answered by either the math director or the science director, they would be available to take a phone call. So just wanted you to know that. And also wanted to mention that we were pleased to see that Representative Sharon Tomiko Santos also was very supportive. She sent a letter to you and indicating her support for this. With that, we're going to turn it over to Dr. Chadwick to begin.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me back. I'm pretty excited to be here to be presenting these, especially as I hear the kind and wonderful words that are being used to describe this as a great move forward and well thought out and sophisticated level. So this has been such a great adventure for us to dive into course equivalencies and to think that we're helping to expand options for students in order to reach their personal goals in a way that's rigorous and relevant to them. As a very quick recap of the process, because we went through most of the process last time we were with you, we had a first round review where practicing CTE instructors identified the relevant skills and standards that were taught in the CTE courses, including the math or the science standards that were relevant. We then brought together technical working groups that were composed of both CTE teachers and either math or science experts to review those first round results and add, subtract, change the standards that were addressed in the units of each course. EPIC then made initial recommendations to OSPI regarding the course equivalency, or made the recommendation that further work was needed in order to get a particular framework up to a level that would allow for supervisors and the science or math director at OSPI. So there's been a lot of eyeballs on these frameworks, all 613 pages of them, which I'm sure you all read last night quickly in about 45 minutes or so. As a summary, for the mathematics equivalencies, we ended up with 10 equivalencies. So there were 10 courses that had an equivalent for math. There were 4 that were determined to be an equivalent for Algebra 1, 3 that were an equivalent for geometry, 1 that was an equivalent for Algebra 2, 1 that was for statistics, and 1 that was a credit beyond geometry. And so this would be a 3rd year or a 4th year mathematics course, assuming geometry was took in 10th grade, but it was less specific regarding a one-to-one correspondence with an existing basic education course. To give you an example of like how the number of standards covered broke down in these courses, we looked at 3 of the courses that have Algebra 1 equivalency, and it really covers all because financial math and consumer and family resources cover almost identical math standards. So they're very, very similar. So we looked at, we used the Algebra 1 end of course exam, and we looked at the number of clusters of standards that were covered and the number of specific standards that were covered. And you'll see that within each cluster, there's 20 clusters covered in the end of course exam, 56 total standards, so there's roughly 3 standards per cluster. They don't come out quite that way, some have 1, some have 4, but close enough. And then we looked at these CTE course equivalents and found that the EOC exam covered 20 clusters. All of the CTE courses cover 16 of those 20 clusters, and the number of specific standards covered ranged from 30 to 48. And so we felt that, you know, if you want to be able to dive deeper, this is actually a pretty heavy lift. And I think that can be said for all the courses across math and science. In fact, you said it, it's a heavy lift. These are pretty sophisticated courses. So we're lifting these up and really providing the rigor that's expected, and yet it doesn't cover everything in the basic education course, because then it would just be basic education, and where would you have room to address the industry standards or the real applied nature of this. So we felt like this was still a heavy lift, but it was providing enough that the kids are going to be able to pass and do well on the end of course exam. In fact, it's going to be very interesting to see how they do, because these kids have had a chance to really dive deep and apply that knowledge in a way that those in the basic education courses don't. For science equivalencies, we have 4 courses that are a biology or lab science equivalent, 5 courses that are just a lab science. They do not have a specific equivalency in terms of a named course. 1 that's a physics or lab science, and 1 that is just science that is not a lab science. And notably, when you look at the equivalence that's just a science course, not a lab science, and you go back to the mathematics where it was 1 credit beyond geometry, those are both for the computer programming course that are, through legislation, determined must have a math and science equivalency. So for computer programming, we were under mandate to make these, to make sure that it was equivalent for both math and science. And to do so, they didn't come out quite the way that the other courses did. This course was unique for both math and science in terms of its equivalency. Now, we don't have an NGSS aligned end of course exam to look at the performance expectations that were covered. So what we did is we went to the Next Generation Science Standards book and looked at Appendix K. Appendix K provides an example of a biology course and what performance expectations would be covered in a biology course. So we thought that would at least give NGSS framework. So these are fairly well aligned, but able to go a little bit deeper. They don't cover quite as much, so that they can incorporate those industry standards and, I think, as important, the real application of the information that these students are learning. Now, there was a question about the course that offers math or science credit, because there will be cases where a course can offer a credit in science or math. Well, how does that happen? Well, there's two frameworks, and at the local level, they're going to have to decide on one framework or another. Now, there could be courses offered, but whatever course, whatever framework that teacher uses in that particular course, the students in that course will be eligible for that framework's credit. So, for computer programming, a teacher is going to have to determine whether to use the science equivalency framework or the math equivalency framework, and that will be the only credit that will be offered, the equivalent credit that will be offered. It'll depend on which framework they use. There was also a question about how is there alignment or integration between the industry standards and the math or science standards. So I decided to give you an example of each. And this is from residential carpentry, one of my favorites, although like Linda, I also went through consumer and family resources and decided that I could have benefited greatly had I been allowed to take that course in high school. I also could have benefited by taking residential carpentry instead of honors geometry, which is what I took, because I would have understood perhaps how to actually use geometry in the real world. If you look here, this is on the wall and ceiling framing unit, and the students are asked to describe how to properly lay out a wood frame wall. Well, the mathematics standard is experiment with transformations in the plane. Now, one of the things that we're going to have to do with teachers during the implementation phase is help them to learn the vocabulary. They're actually, a lot of the CTE teachers are doing the math, they're doing the science, but they may not be using the same language, the same vocabulary that's being used in the basic education math or science course. So some of this is just, it's translation. So that, there's that will have to happen. But you can see here that there's, in this particular unit, looking at the math standards and the industry standards, these kids are learning geometry by learning how to frame a wall or a ceiling. Then we also looked at animal science and just looked at history and use of animals. And this is an agricultural course, so it's dealing with the domesticated animals for use in livestock, for livestock. And we have the agriculture, food, and natural resources standards, and then the next generation science standards, the Washington science standards. And the students are asked by the industry standards to evaluate and describe characteristics of animals that developed in response to the animal's environment and led to their domestication. In the science standards, they're asked to evaluate the evidence supporting claims that changes in environmental conditions may result in this, that, and the other. So there's definitely an overlap. They're asked to do maybe slightly different things, a slightly higher depth of knowledge, cognitive processing, more evaluate, synthesize in the next generation science standards, but the basics are there in the industry standards. And the same with looking at classification of animal species, and then being able to communicate scientific information about common ancestry and biological evolution. There's definitely a lot of the same information that's in both, and it's just bringing those together. So what are the next steps? I think you all have identified a lot of those next steps already. Linda did in her presentation, and in your questions and comments, you have identified those as well. There needs to be quite a bit of professional development. We're going to start with an orientation to the frameworks and implementation models that districts may consider. And then there will, of course, have to be content knowledge, PD on content knowledge and kind of the integration of industry standards with the math or the science standards. I mean, there's definitely going to be that kind of professional development needed. There's going to have to be implementation have use. They may have co-teaching. They may, for applied algebra 2, they may have their regular algebra 2 teacher take professional development on how to do a lot more application and hands-on work and teach applied